One of the most impacting things I found when I went to the World Prayer Assembly was actually walking into the prayer room, which was in the prayer tower next to the convention centre. We'd actually been part of a gathering of like 9,000 people praying, but there was something about the dynamic of that room which had had 24/7 prayer happening in it for virtually over 12 years. And if you imagine constantly people praying, calling out to God for their nation, there's a dynamic to going in that room which I'd only heard about. In fact, my friend said to me, "Chrissie, you need to go in there." She said, "The presence of God is amazing." And she'd gone in there, she said, and just burst into tears. And apparently that's quite a common response when people first walk in the room. It's a tangible presence of God. So I went in the room kind of thinking, well, okay, I'm open. And it was true. You just couldn't help but begin to weep. And even recalling the experience causes tears to come to me, because God was there. His love, His presence, His ear. You know, you felt you could pray prayers in that room and God would hear. Whilst in the main plenary, there was one particular time when they called forward the Chinese church to come and pray. And it had been quite interesting because amongst this 9,000 people there were blocks of Koreans and blocks of Chinese. Because of the translation, they needed to put them together. And it was visually very powerful to see the huge number of Korean and Chinese there praying over the assembly. But this time when the Chinese church were called forward, we'd actually all been called to pray for our own nations. And I'd been standing there with these British people. And if you know the British in prayer, well, it's all very kind of safe and nice. And we'd been praying and the prayer had gone on. But all of a sudden in my spirit, I became distracted by the Chinese praying church. And as I looked over, I saw them on their knees, with their hands raised, with tears streaming down their face, crying out to God for their nation and for the nations of the world. And I thought, oh God, that's what we need. We need to be so passionate about seeing God move in our nation, that we cry prayers to you, that we call out to you, and from the heart. And there was something that was imparted to me just watching them. I caught something of the passion, and all of a sudden I turned around and it was like, oh, scrap those prayers, you know. Come on, let's pray for our nation. And the dynamic of prayer that began to rise then in our praying as we gathered wasn't British. It was suddenly this impartation of passion and tears. And God, do something in Europe like you're doing in Asia. Do something. We need you, God. And that was a very powerful moment that will stay with me. And I hope the impartation that came to me in that small moment can be imparted to others through my story at that time. It was interesting to facilitate the prayer for children at risk. And it was such a blessing because we ended up having the privilege of having the network coordinator for Khon Khmer in Cambodia come to the prayer assembly. He came with his family, and they actually brought 3 young women, 14-year-old girls, and they were actually from the province that's on the border with Thailand, between Cambodia and Thailand. And these 3 young girls had a powerful testimony. One of them was brave enough to share her story in the prayer gathering for children at risk. And it was interesting because she was obviously having to speak in Khmer, and then Pani translated into English, and then there was English into Indonesian, so it was a really interesting dynamic going on there. But somehow I think it made the story more poignant because it cost the girl to tell the story. And in essence, it was that she had, on the borders, there is an expectation in the culture almost, because of the poverty, that when girls get to a certain age, they are sent across the border to make money. Now, we know it as human trafficking, but actually it's a way of life. There is somehow intrinsic in the thinking of the communities that for them to have money to live, their daughters, when they get to that age, will go and make the money for them. So this young woman, that was the expectation for her. And God broke in, and she became a Christian. And it absolutely devastated the family, and they were furious. Because all of a sudden, the destiny they had planned for her no longer counted, because God's destiny he had his hands on her. She'd become a Christian. She'd come to know Jesus. And she didn't want to do this walk. She didn't want to go this route. So you can imagine the emotional dynamics there of a young girl being rejected by her parents. And as she told this story, it was a very powerful moment. And she was kind of weeping in this storytelling. And the other two girls, her friends, who had similar stories, were weeping. And within the context of the praying group, we were able to really pour out prayers for healing for them in a way, because that's incredible wounding and incredible cost. But we know that God will glorify their stories, in His time. And actually, the end of the story is good because they were actually released by the parents. The network has been able to begin to work with the community and find alternative means of supporting the families so that the girls didn't need to go and be involved in the trafficking. But it's a really tough area, and it's a huge emotional cost, and they've really paid a price, and God is being glorified, and things are being worked out in that community as a result.